Now, I'm pretty sure almost everyone is familiar with Greek mythology, but have you ever heard of Japanese mythology? The mythology of Japan dates back to more than 2,000 years ago and is made up of the traditions of the Japanese people, including their customs, practices, gods, and legends. The mythology is used to explain many aspects of their life, including the creation of the earth, and at times back then was used to create the power structure of Japanese society. Now, throughout my research of Japanese mythology, I found many interesting stories about the different gods, myths, and creatures of the Shinto society, since mythology is a part of two different religions, right? One of them being Buddhism, which originated in India and came into Japan from China, and the other one being Shinto. I chose Japanese mythology for a couple of reasons. One of them was it was because it was something that I wanted to learn about and also share with my peers. Secondly, mythology does play an important role in the lives of Japanese people today, since many of the legends are the basis of their art, literature, drama, movies, pop culture. So what I'm gonna just be doing here for today for you guys, I'm just going to be explaining different stories of the main deities of Japanese mythology, and I'm just gonna be touching up on some of the lesser known gods and creatures and how they affect Japanese traditions and culture today. Now, the first story that I do want to go over with you guys about is the story of Izanami and Izanagi, who are a couple of brother and sisters, and they were part of the seventh generation of gods and goddesses. The older gods, Izanami and Izanagi, were given a task which included bringing the world into shape. They were given a spear, and with that spear, they created both the island of Onogoro, which is where they built their palace and also took refuge. After settling down, they tried to have children but were met with many obstacles. After failing many different times, they both went to their elder gods for advice, and he let them know that they were approaching their husband or wife incorrectly, which caused them to have the failure of trying to, to give birth. Izanami was able to conceive after the elders' advice and gave birth to eight great islands, but after trying to conceive gods to shape these islands, she died while giving birth to the god of fire. Enraged, her brother Izanagi kills the god of fire and goes to the land of dead to look for Izanami. He finds her rotting in the house of dead, and soon after, Izanami became known as the goddess of death. This is the story that the Japanese people used to explain how the islands came about and where the concepts of life and death actually come from. Now, the second story that I want to talk about is this story of Amaterasu, which is the daughter of Izanami and Izanagi. Amaterasu is the god of sun, goddess of sun, who brings light into the world. The people of Japan glorify her as the ruler of the universe, and many Japanese emperors have claimed power from making a divine right to claim imperial positions. With Izanami being the goddess of death, Amaterasu is the goddess of creation. Her position is bringing light where there is darkness and illuminating the world, and this is very significant to the Japanese people since the sun does represent order and purity. In the hierarchy system of Japanese society, those who claim descent from Amaterasu are those who are in power and sit at the top. This is obviously no longer practiced, but it's just interesting to really think about how one would validate their claim as a descendant of Amaterasu. Amaterasu's story follows a dispute between her and her brother Susanoo, and that ends up with him rampaging and destroying most of the heaven and earth. Amaterasu ends up going into exile, hiding, while the world is plunged into chaos. She ends up returning, illuminating the world after receiving a dance from one of her fellow goddesses, and she tries to assign her grandson to rule over the world. But after declining, his great grandson eventually takes over and becomes the first emperor of Japan. Now, when researching mythological gods of Japan, you tend to notice a trend. The gods always have a control of over an aspect of life, whether that includes life itself or the natural elements like wind, fire, or water. Just like most mythological stories. The stories are always tied with a sad story that explains where the god came from. Back then, people will associate the occurrence of an event with a god. For example, if it thunderstorms, you must have angered the thunder god Raijin. So now, when it comes to everyday life in Japan, religions like Buddhism and Shintoism are not preached but are intertwined within the culture and social values of the Japanese people. Most people in Japan don't identify with a religion but practice religious customs of events like a childbirth or a death of a family member, and they do also tend to participate in the festivals. Now, if we're talking about Japanese society today, then we can't ignore the actions of World War II. After losing the war, the emperor renounced his ties with the gods and shook the beliefs in the belief system of the Japanese people. and this pushed them farther away from any direct belief within the religion, since the deities still affect most of the lives today of the Japanese people, but in the culture, the religion is really not taken as seriously. Now, the mythological stories of the gods of Japan were extremely interesting because their stories actually derive from human experiences and all have very beautiful stories that can be used to teach lessons. Now, one of the most important things that I learned throughout my research was how emperors were given power by claiming that their ancestor was Amaterasu. They were able to achieve emperor status, and we found out later in World War II that the emperors ended up lying to the Japanese people, causing them to eventually have a fallout within their belief system. Now, the deities are still being used today in Japanese pop culture, including their anime shows that have been popularized by Western culture.